I thought that I'd take this sort of graveyard shift. I know it's been a long day, and with that in mind, I tried to come up with something that I thought you'd all find hopefully reasonably interesting. And I've used my most full-on PowerPoint style I've ever used, so it keeps everybody awake. This is sort of an exploration of the topic. It's something that I've become aware of as I've been researching other topics on the goldfields, and I'm quite fascinated by it. I'm not especially knowledgeable about it at the moment, but it's a really interesting topic, and there's lots and lots of good stories, so we might be able to develop it further. It ties in a lot with what we've been talking about with mobility, creating new identities, and I think there's a lot of creative solutions involved as well. So initially, talking about marriage during Victorian times, I found it's sort of a lot less straightforward than I initially thought that it might be when I began researching women on the New Zealand goldfields. It seems that people found themselves in incompatible marriages, and while the social and legal structures were relatively rigid, people, if it didn't suit them, they seemed to have been able to find ways around it, as people do. In the early tumultuous years on the goldfields, when people were moving from place to place, did make it easy for people to reinvent themselves. Women and men left their spouses, they changed their names, and some women particularly used a bewildering array of aliases, which makes it really challenging to research them, even if they are a bit wayward and they do turn up. They're hard to match sometimes. When Mary Bailey was arrested in June 1864, her aliases included Mary Tripp, Mary Smith and Mary Doyle. Similarly, when a judge asked a defendant in a court case for her name, she replied Alice Stoker, at present. When asked for an explanation, she said that her maiden name was Alice Cummin and that she'd been married to a Mr. Caton, but she was now living with William Stoker. When again asked what her name was, she persisted with Alice Stoker, but exasperated, the judge told her that her name was Alice Caton. And I initially thought that the shifting and temporary nature of the goldfields meant that people could hide their identities and reinvent themselves. But I'm increasingly starting to think that communication was much stronger than I'd thought, and that, as we talked about, there was lots of relationships going on. People may have moved from different places, but so did everybody else, so there was lots of people that knew them. And sometimes I think that the knowledge that people were creating new identities was actually just quite hard to avoid. And while marriage was obviously the source of problems for some people, it could be very convenient at times. When the Nelson provincial government, who governed the northern goldfields on the west coast, made a law that prohibited single women from holding hotel licences, marriage suddenly became very convenient indeed. The registers show the sudden popularity of marriage in the mining towns of Charleston, Brighton and Westport, with many miners making very advantageous unions. I mean, these were women who had money and probably miners who hopefully had something to offer, but other than just a surname. At Hokitika Museum we answer a lot of research inquiries, and one thing, a common complaint that we hear is that people can't find their ancestors' marriage certificate. They had their first child in such and such a date, so they must have been married by then, and we gently try and explain that, well, we have the idea that people only started living together without marriage in the last 40 odd years or so. That's actually not the case at all, and that perhaps they should look later, or perhaps think about why their ancestors might not have been married. And that's a number of reasons why people lived together as husband and wife but weren't actually married. Some, it seems it was just a temporary arrangement, it was economic, it suited them at the time. Others simply arrived at a town and rather than go through the formalities of marriage, they just presented themselves as a married couple. And others couldn't get married because one or both of them were already married. An example of this is Louisa Byng, the daughter of an African American who had a hotel at Mount Gambier in South Australia. She married James Diggle on the Victorian goldfields in 1863, and their first child was born the following year. Doesn't appear to have been a happy marriage, because by 1871 she was in Ross having a child with a miner named Godfrey Copley. Copley. And although the couple presented themselves as being married, they weren't. And Godfrey was listed as the child's father on the birth certificates, but they were registered under the surname Diggle. She was still in contact with her family in Australia. She had a large number of brothers and sisters, but maybe they didn't know of her new status. And I wonder how she claimed a letter addressed to Mrs. James Diggle from the local post office without embarrassment. Her husband was killed in a mining accident near Castlemaine on the 5th of August 1874, and she was able to marry Godfrey, and she did 6 weeks later. So the communication was pretty speedy as well. 8 years, and as a postscript to her life, 8 years later her second husband was killed in a mining accident as well, so she married again, and she'd had 9 children by that stage, and she had another 3 after her third marriage before dying in 1928. And Hokitika pioneers, John and Mary Hudson, were another respectable couple who it turns out were not initially married. They had their first child in Hokitika in 1866. It was only after the birth of their third child in 1870 that they secretly got married in Christchurch. And in his entry in the local edition of the Encyclopedia of New Zealand, John Hudson said that he and Mary Higgins were married in 1866, which is just another great example of what great liars the Victorians were. And divorce was almost unknown during Goldrush times, and although it was scandalous and threatened the sanctity of marriage, it did happen. New Zealand's first divorce law was passed in 1867, with men being able to get a divorce if they could prove their wife's adultery, but women needed to prove adultery and either sodomy, incest, bestiality, bigamy, rape, or extreme cruelty. As you can imagine, this made divorce not an especially attractive option for women. Divorces were also very expensive. In 1887, the initial cost of the action for Frances Webb, whose husband had fathered several children with another woman, was £59. That's about $11,000 in today's money. So they needed to have some way of paying for that. But some people were able to pay the costs of obtaining a divorce and willing to suffer the notoriety that the proceedings inevitably entailed. The first divorce proceedings on the West Coast were brought by Louisa Pirani against her husband Henry. Louisa Levy, she'd married the journalist Henry Pirani, who was 17 years her senior, in Victoria in 1856, and the couple had moved to Hokitika in 1867, where Henry worked at the Star of the Evening newspaper. By this time the couple had 7 children. Soon after their arrival in Hokitika, Henry began a relationship with Selina Williams, otherwise called Eliza Mansell, otherwise known as Frances Holdcroft, then of Hokitika but now of Sandridge, Victoria, barmaid. Louisa appears to have had money of her own, which is presumably how she could afford to try and get a divorce, and alleged that after the barmaid's departure, Henry extorted large sums of money from her by using violence and threats of violence. And this is interesting, in every divorce case that I've looked at so far, women referred to cruelty and violence rather than any of the other options that they had. After the first hearing, Louisa appears not to have proceeded further, and she was Henry's widow when she died in Melbourne in 1901. But it's worth noting that although that there were no more children after she started the divorce proceedings, even though they were successful, they appear to have lived separately since. And for some people, being married was more important than breaking the law, and there are actually a surprising number of examples of bigamous marriages on the West Coast and on the Goldfields generally. Which perhaps did have the desired effect, as there's no record of a marriage occurring in the 1870s. Alfred died in Wanganui in 1891, but 10 years earlier she had got tired of waiting and she'd married John Cohen in Sydney. And it's not clear how often spouses knew they were marrying bigamously, but this was certainly the case for Elizabeth McGee. She was a barmaid in Charleston and Westport, and she'd married miner Thomas Braithwaite at Charleston in 1868. And soon after left the West Coast with him for California. At some point, Elizabeth found out that her husband was already married, and she promptly returned to New Zealand, reverted to her maiden name, and she became the manager of the Prince Alfred Hotel in Westport. Meanwhile, Braithwaite's first wife, who had married in Castlemaine in 1861 and whom he had 2 children with, had heard of his second marriage and had contacted the police. Braithwaite had followed Elizabeth back to Westport and turned up at the Prince Alfred Hotel. While Elizabeth was out of the room, he snuck upstairs and tried to steal her money, but she discovered him and called the police, and then the police promptly arrested him for bigamy as well. But due to a muck-up with witnesses, he was discharged. The following year, Elizabeth married the arresting officer, New York-born sergeant. You couldn't write this stuff, could you? Charles Longton Neville. He turns out to be really interesting. He was brought up in Italy, and his father was a military man who abandoned them. Meanwhile, Braithwaite returned to his first wife in Christchurch, and the couple had another 5 children. Before he married bigamously again, this time in Victoria, to Mary Toohey, with whom he had 2 children before his death in 1894. Jane Norgate was born in Norfolk, and she went to Australia in 1856 and found work in Melbourne as a domestic servant. In 1860, she had a daughter Alice with labourer and mariner Lawrence Gautrell. And then in 1864, she married David McCarthy, also a mariner. And he was also known as Timothy O'Brien. And then, and this is not my work, this is a wonderful work family historians done, Cynthia McCorgan. In 1868, she married, probably bigamously, another mariner called Martin Peterson. Then she and her daughter came to the West Coast, and she worked as a nurse and midwife at Stafford, Greenstone and Greymouth, until in 1872 they walked to the new town of Reefton and obtained positions at the brand new hospital there. And then in 1879 she married David Bradshaw, again who was the manager of the hospital, and again this is another bigamous marriage because we know that at least one of her previous husbands was still alive. And while she was lucky, she got away with 2 bigamous marriages, at least 2 bigamous marriages. Emily Matilda Livingston wasn't so lucky. At Auckland in December 1864, as Ellen Kane, she had married a Lance Corporal of Her Majesty's 14th Regiment, Alexander Livingston. She was only 16, and the couple did not live together as the marriage had taken place without the consent of the commanding officer, and they appear to have been separated when his regiment was posted to Wanganui. By January 1866, Emily was in Nelson and met West Coast storekeeper George Dyer. After keeping company for 3 or 4 days, the couple were married, with Emily using the surname Smith. 3 weeks after the marriage, Emily told her husband that she had been married before, had a child, and that her husband was still living. Dyer then went to the authorities, explaining that while he wasn't anxious to convict her, he wanted to be free of her. Emily was charged with bigamy, and the paper quoted about the court case saying the prisoner, who was shedding tears, pleaded guilty. His Honour said that the prisoner had pleaded guilty to a crime of a high nature in the eyes of God and man, and had violated the most solemn vows. She had committed the crime deliberately and intentionally, and not, as was sometimes the case, where the husband was long absent under the supposition that he was dead. And she was sentenced to 2 years hard labour, which was a pretty stiff sentence. George Dyer married again to another woman called Hannah Smith. So Smith was a common name, obviously. Hopefully it was her real one. And I'll finish off with, this is just a wonderful story that combines bigamy and divorce. They sometimes come together in these kind of glorious stories. In 1868, Edward Lewis, a butcher by trade, and Margaret Maloney were married at Brighton. And after their marriage, they lived at Hokitika for a short time. Then they followed the rush to Gympie in Queensland. From there, they went to Townsville, and had apparently only been there for a few days when Margaret was sent to jail for drunkenness and disorderly conduct. After her release, according to Edward, Margaret disappeared and he could not find her. He returned to the West Coast and lived at Stafford for about 8 years before marrying Annie Duncan on Christmas Day 1877. 2 years after the second marriage, Edward received a visit from the police telling him that his first wife was still alive. And it appears that a decision was made to just ignore this unwelcome piece of news, and the police certainly took no further action. All proceeded well until in 1882 Margaret turned up and wanted to move into her husband's house. Poor Annie, she moved out, and then Edward moved out as well. and 4 or 5 days later, Margaret gave up and she moved down to Hokitika. And Edward and Annie just resumed living together again until Annie's death in 1885. And in 1886, Edward Lewis applied for a divorce from Margaret on the account of her adultery with William Bulling, a widower of Hokitika, who admitted that he had had improper relations with Margaret. Margaret Lewis countered by accusing her husband of committing adultery with Mrs. Elizabeth Stevens, wife number 2's carer, after his second wife's death. And, actually, sorry, I forgot to refer to this slide earlier. So when Margaret turned up, Edward put this advert in the paper saying, because legally he was still, as his wife, he was still responsible for her debts. So he put this ad in, but he doesn't say, mostly they say, I will not be responsible for my wife, such and such a name's debts, but he didn't actually put that in this advert. I guess it must have been very hard on his second wife. The judge actually refused Edward's request for a divorce, and it seems because he was an adulterer himself. That seems to have been, it's quite hard to tell from the newspaper accounts. And after that, Edward just disappears. I can't find him anywhere. But Margaret remained in Hokitika and she died here in 1906. And that is it. That's as far as I've got with my divorce and bigamy, but it's a fascinating topic, and I think it just goes to show how inventive people could be, and lots of people knew. There's no way that people didn't know. They knew someone had been in Castlemaine or wherever, and they knew that they had a wife, and they knew probably they were still alive, but it wasn't worth doing anything about.